Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inner Fire Climbing Podcast. I am Jesse Firestone. My guest today on the show is Tom Herbert, aka Useful Coach. I have worked with him myself and referred clients to him for nutrition coaching, so Tom and I know each other decently well. I guess all I'll say up front is Tom knows a lot about a lot of things, so we bounced around a lot. We talked about flow and dance and cognitive behavioral therapy and hypnotherapy and the dentist. And I somehow managed to pretzel logic my way into relating all of that back to climbing, as I usually do. We covered a lot of unsurprisingly philosophical ground, and the time passed very quickly. So please enjoy. It's a long one, but I think there's a lot of good stuff in here. And without further ado, Tom Herbert. Tom Herbert, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
How's it going today?
Very good. Very good.
Nice.
I've been out in the sunshine. London is particularly happy. We have our 2 weeks of summer, and then it's all downhill. But it's good. We're all happy. Everyone's in a good mood. So
that's awesome. Yeah, I love that feeling when spring arrives and everybody's nicer and happier. It's just a good time. For sure. Thanks for. I think you're showing up late to a dance class or something for this. So thanks for making space in your schedule. I appreciate it.
It's fine. I'm sure they can wait. My dance-saturated life. I'm sure I can make space.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about that some today. Well, I know you've done a lot of other podcasts and even your own podcast at times in the climbing world. So maybe, people probably know who you are, but can you just summarize what you do and what you help athletes and climbers with? Because I feel like you have a lot of hats, but if people follow you on Instagram, they might actually think that you're a dance influencer. Yeah. So tell us what you help people with.
I can tell you what I don't do. So a lot of people know me in the climbing community as a useful coach. And originally what I came in to do with people was basically purely nutrition coaching. And that was through the lens at the time, and this was about 5-6 years ago, a lot about under-eating, low energy availability and things like that. And through that, I basically have developed working with people on a much deeper level. And I'm retooling myself in terms of skill set to just work on a kind of behavioral, cognitive part. But my heart is really, in a sense, from my brand, is to be useful. And so I'm really trying to come in and support people to use nutrition and other parts, maybe a bit of life coaching type stuff, just to try and to try and identify limitations in their world and try and get rid of those or manipulate those or try and have a little bit more of a softer focus on those and really try and major most of their time on the things that are going to work with them, and also understand that life changes. And it's not as smooth sailing the whole time. So it's becoming much more holistic. When I started, It was strength and conditioning and carbohydrates. And now it's a lot more of like, hey, how's that working for you stuff, which I love. And that's kind of where my passion is. Yeah,
that's super relatable because, I'm the same. Basically, it's like the longer I coach, the more holistic and zoomed out I want to be, because I guess strength and conditioning carbohydrates is a funny way to put it. And for me, it's kind of like the obsession with maximum finger strength numbers, like how much weight you can hang. It's like a great example of like something we could focus on for 12 weeks. And it might really help a certain type of climber, or it might have absolutely no impact at all, or even like send them backwards a little bit to focus on that for 12 weeks, And so the longer you kind of work with people on that kind of stuff, the more compelled you are to sort of zoom out and see what else is going on. I often like phrase it as limiting factors, like what are the limiting factors for this person's progress? And it sounds like you really think about it the same way.
Yeah, and I think it's a nice phrase because I think it's I don't like absolutes now, and I'm sure you see this in coaching as well. It's very easy in the beginning to think in terms of absolutes, even in terms of programming, right? When you first start as a coach, you read books and then you put things on a spreadsheet and you think, oh, this is the perfect plan with all this variation and different things, and then you work with a real human being and you realize, wow, that's not important at all. And then you try and figure out what is the thing that is actually going to create change, and even that's up for debate. So a lot of times we can identify, in my first call, I will identify, these are quite glaring, obvious things that we can adjust. And then you ask them, well, how likely is it that this is going to be able to be changed? Mm-hmm. And then you realize, oh, actually, okay, those things will have to sit back a little bit, and we'll figure out what is a different way of doing something. And sometimes, like for instance, when I'm working with people who have families, sometimes it's like, hey, do you want to buy a meal service? Have you ever thought of buying a meal service so that you have more time to sit with your partner at the dinner table? And that's the fun part of it, is trying to identify, that, and then also use them as launch pads and building blocks. And I'm very much now, I view everything through what I call upstream. Like, what can we change up here that is quite easy, perhaps, that will have this trickle-down effect that will make people be able to behave and do and apply more, let's say, disciplined things later. And that can be, I mean, one of my favorite examples, I was working with somebody who was really depressed, and she was really struggling to find the motivation to go and climb. She was always struggling with her relationships, she was struggling with body image, there was a lot going on. And in the end, the fix was me asking her to have a Snickers bar when she got home. Because what happened is that it hit two things. One, I gave her permission to eat something which she thought was bad food, right? Mm-hmm. And I explained why this is not the case. And two, she realized that when she had something sugary when she got home, it was a stimulus in terms of just well-being, because it's something sugary. And two, lo and behold, she had the energy to get off the couch, to go to the climbing center, because both of us know that when you exercise, it releases endorphins, you feel great about yourself. Life dramatically changes after a training, right? And so it was from that. So from a Snickers bar after work, basically changed her entire life, because it gave her that bit of sugar. She went and did what she loved to do. She got a different view of herself. She stopped worrying about her body image because she was doing her climbing. She had a wider friend circle. Her relationship. I mean, it was crazy. I should write a book about just a Snickers bar, the power of a Snickers bar. But there's so many little things like this where you kind of, and that's obviously as we do in coaching, is we try and identify, hey, why don't you try this little thing? Push against this thing that you hadn't thought of. And normally that unlocks a lot of stuff,
Yeah, I really like to think of coaching as like nudges, like yes. Where the little tiny places where you can make a difference. And I do write big, complex spreadsheets, of training stuff for people too, because I think largely because that's what people, want. I think people kind of expect that. And so I do try to deliver that as well, because, at the end of the day, I am selling a product. But I try to, if it makes any sense, I try to hide a lot of simplicity in that complexity, and leave a lot of room for things to work. But in the end, it's like the little stuff, like suggesting that people have a Snickers bar when they get home, that stuff tends to make a really big difference. And I mean, that's an easy sell for me, because I fucking love a Snickers bar. It's just a great choice. Like if I'm coming home from climbing and I didn't bring a snack with me, and I like stop at the gas station to get gas or something like that, there's a very high chance that I'm going to get a Snickers bar. That's like the go-to. I have a client right now who we took the third day of climbing out of his weekly schedule, and replaced it with a day where he does meal prep for the rest of the week and does cardio, because he wasn't keeping up with his cardio as much as he wanted to, and he wants to improve his general capacity. And I was like, look, if you can fit a third climbing session in after this stuff, that's great. But like what I'm going to write in the spreadsheet is that you're going to get your meal prep done, so that we know that the other sessions are going to be high quality, because he has like a really busy job and stuff. And that's an experiment. I don't know if that'll actually work. But, if the client is the type of person where putting something in the spreadsheet increases their sort of accountability for it, then I'm starting to feel like you could almost put anything in there. It's like pretty within reason, because, I do want to look at it systemically, but obviously their whole life is not my job in the end.
And I think, I know we kind of went in this direction, coaching on coaching. I think was so rewarding, and if there's any coaches listening to this podcast, know that one of the things I could really encourage you to do is to really listen far more, and go into every session and with every client with almost no agenda. Mm-hmm. Not to say that you don't have a direction, right? You always have a direction, but when you work with different people, you start to realize that for some people, they love filling out every little thing. They want all the details. They kind of have like an engineer type mindset. For some people, they completely glaze over. I've had clients who have got to the end of my coaching after like maybe 2 or 3 months, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't even know you had documentation."
Yeah.
Right? Because it didn't resonate with them, and it wasn't needed necessarily. It wasn't. They don't need to read a whole tome on AMPK signaling in the muscle, right? It doesn't mean anything to them necessarily. And so I think what's really nice is that, yes, my starting spreadsheet, which is like a dashboard of numbers and calculations on fat-free mass and RMR and all this, I set that up almost more for me because I get to see an overview of everybody, where they are, body composition and energy values. But most of the time I start with that and say, look, this is here, and I can go through how I get all these different energy availability numbers, and but it's not necessary for change. It's just, it provides this sort of granulation, which we then make decisions off, and I see how far people are away from targets. But I think that the fun part of the coaching part is to figure that out, right? How do you communicate to somebody in a way that is going to be sticky and resonate, and also be the, in want of a better metaphor, the next domino that pushes the other one, but like almost an upwards domino, if there was a metaphor like that,
Even if people aren't interested in coaching, it should be pretty directly relevant. Like the phrase that really sticks in my head, and this is actually from mentorship that I did in my previous life, which is what made me realize that I wanted to lean into the coaching thing. I was like, running a team of developers and like mentoring developers, and one of our principles at that company was to meet people where they're at, which was both for like inside the company and for our clients. And I actually at one point had a sticky note on my monitor that said meet people where they're at, because I was so bad at showing up to meetings and just, being very task oriented and trying to sort of earn my salary and not being thoughtful about like what might be happening with that person. And I sort of started to be more socially focused, and it actually just, it's productive in every way. But the real turning point for me was when I started using that on myself, because like I'm not the same every day, and sometimes things are really complicated, and so like kind of meeting myself where I'm at, I think, is a really valuable lesson too. So if people are coaches, that's a really great thing to learn. But if people are self coaches, I think it's just as important, or even like maybe more important, because then they can kind of use that nudge or that accountability on themselves. And at the end of the day, every climber, I say this to my clients too, like if you're a World Cup climber and you go to the World Cup and your coach is literally there with you at the competition, that's great. That's relatively like rare in the broader climbing community. Like most people who have coaches have a remote coach who they're meeting with them sometimes, and then they're going climbing by themselves. And really the job of that coach, my job in that relationship, and this is pretty similar to you too, because you're not actually looking at your client while they're cooking food or making their decisions. They are self-coaches at the end of the day. They're just self-coaches with a lot of guidance and mentorship. Whereas like maybe, competition climber or something is going to have like much more direct coaching. And I do coach people in person and coach people outside too. But, the majority of my clients are remote clients. And really what I'm teaching them to do is to be better self-coaches. And that meeting yourself where you're at thing is such an important part of that.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is sometimes the dynamic between Americans and Europeans and Americans and the rest of the world in terms of how they perceive my coaching style. Mm-hmm. The way I coach people is very much getting them to try and come up with the answers themselves. And I do what I call long form coaching. So I have basically people can do as many calls as they want with me. And the purpose of that is I have an idea of where I want to take people. But most of the time I'm trying to say, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think would be a better outcome? Or how do you perceive yourself here? Or what would be the best version of you here? And all this sort of stuff. Even when they're asking for some sort of meal plan, which I try and push back against, because I'm not a fan of writing meal plans for anybody. It's a lot of work for little yield. I'm like, well, what do you think you could eat here? But funny enough, sometimes Americans want a lot more direct, tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. And that's been quite an interesting cultural thing, where I've actually had to work on myself to be like, for these clients, not all, but for some clients, you need to be much more assertive and tell them what to do rather than doing this sort of more discovery. And over time it will change, but for some people, they much prefer being told what to do. However, I would say that I think, and most teachers would understand this, that that's sometimes not the best way for somebody to learn and to remember. And that is that sort of thing of, if you are working from a position where you're constantly being told what to do rather than discovering it for yourself and maybe making mistakes and knowing what doesn't, it doesn't stick as much. And that's why I try and do a little bit kind of in the background and be like, well, this is how I lay it out. This is what is optimal, I think. And I do this merging between what I call textbook recommendations and my experience, and then with their real life. It's like Zen diagram of what's going to work. But ultimately, it's like, what do you think would be a good thing here? And then kind of correct and optimize that. And I just think that's the thing of, like, you know, in coaching, it really is about trying to help people see things from a different angle. And that's where some of the stuff that I'm trying to learn and equip myself on from a therapeutic level is this real constant reframing. Well, this thing happened or didn't happen, so how do we reframe it, or how do you view it differently to have a different outcome in terms of how you feel about it, for instance? And then what actions are you taking or not taking because of how you feel? So, you know, I'm self-developmenting in this as well. But it is an interesting thing, yeah. Ultimately, we're trying to equip people to go off and do this stuff on their own. I mean, even on the most classic sense of, like, calorie tracking or macro tracking, you know, I give people a tool to do that because it is very helpful in the beginning for some people. Not everybody. For some people, it's good. For some people, they carry on tracking their food. But ultimately, it's to get to the point where they just know, well, I've tracked this meal or like this meal a number of times, so I don't need to know what is in it anymore. Because I'm like, well, I can kind of guess that this is going to be 30 grams of protein and 60 grams of carbs. And then you get rid of the tool, right? Because it's not needing... Life doesn't work that way. Some people love it. I've had a guy who tracked his food for a year, which seems impossible to me, but he loved that.
Yeah, I think I have that a little bit with my wife, where, like, if I use a tracker, I kind of want to be as minimal with it as possible. I want to have some purpose or goal that I'm using it for and achieve that goal and then move on. But she loves it for, like, at the end of the day, she can look at the count and be like, I can have 2 Cheez-Its. Like, and I'm like, I can't live like that. Like, I'll just eat as many Cheez-Its as I want and then put them in the tracker. And if it's too much or not enough, like, I'm just getting information from it. I can't use it to, like, guide my decisions, you know?
Even my training plan, my strength and conditioning training plan, I have tried so many times to be very, very progressive in terms of numbers and tracking. And inevitably it tends to be a sort of undulating, go how I feel type thing. And it doesn't mean that I don't do things deliberately. I certainly do. Right? Yeah. But most of the time it's kind of like much more auto-regulated and motivation, and sometimes just slightly change, which can be good and bad. I think there is a meeting point of when you need to understand, let's say, the discipline of holding into something and then also moving away. So this is not a binary thing at all. There's no better way of doing it. You can, on both sides, you can make it suboptimal.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of auto-regulation and S&C, it's interesting to hear that from you, because you're not even really climbing. Like, I don't think climbing is a principal part of what you do. Or are you climbing? Yeah, you're climbing at all? Yeah, not really.
Don't tell anyone.
Whereas, like, I think of auto-regulation as being such a powerful tool for climbers specifically, because the total workload per week is just so variable. You know, like, the route setters reset the slab this week, and so you burn X calories, you know, that week at the gym, and you do so much, you know, X amount of work. And then the next week they reset, like, the super steep, like, roof where all the problems are 20 moves, and, like, you burn, you know, 3X calories and do 3X the amount of work that week. And you're going to just do a 5x5 at the same weights for all your weight room stuff, like, both of those weeks. Like, you're obviously going to get a different stimulus and a different response to that amount of exercise. And then, you know, if people are climbing outside, that's even more dramatic. Like, walking 2 minutes to a boulder versus walking 30 minutes uphill to a boulder is a completely different level of effort.
Yeah, and this also what's so hard about trying to quantify it. I get people all the time who are saying, like, well, how much is this burning? And I was like, I haven't a clue. How are we going to measure this? We can come up with an idea, right? And we can kind of find gradations of it and try and stitch together met values. But most of the time when I work with calories, I kind of grade calories and I put different scenarios in. And then I say, well, the only metric we have is your body weight. It's incredibly rough. We have a margin of error of about 2 kilos either side within 1 or 2 days. But let's track it because that's what we have. And then let's see how you feel, all the other subjective stuff. How's your performance? Okay, cool. Well, if your weight is staying stable, right, and you're feeling great, and you're sleeping well, and your libido's good, and your mood is good, then we probably got about right in terms of the calories. Now, if you have some sort of drama in your life, maybe you're a new parent and your child is sick, we understand and we move those calories around, meaning we put a little bit more in because you're trying to deal with life stuff, right? Or we just scrap tracking this week because it's not important. What's important is whether or not you can handle your kid being ill. So, it's super interesting. I'm sure you've worked with route setters. Have you ever worked with route setters? That's hard. That is really hard because you've got to basically quantify what they're doing 3 or 4 times a week with their own training on top. I had one guy, I think he was pushing about 4,000 calories, just under 4,000 calories on his big day. And it got to the point where he was like, I'm hungry. And I'm like, you know what to do. But he's like, where do I do it? And I was like, this is a job for you. This is a job for you.
Peanut butter milkshakes.
It was like crazy, like just candies and putting processed food in the bits that we can, because it's just much more easy to get a lot more calories in. But it was hard work.
It's like, it needs to be like hyper palatable. For me, at least when I was setting routes, it needs to be hyper palatable because I'm not going to stop setting routes to eat a burrito. I know some people who could do that, but I like needed candy or something that I could just grab while I was thinking about setting. Guys, because I set routes for like quite a long time.
Okay.
I got a chance to coach like a laborer, like I think he was a framer or a carpenter or something, really strong boulderer. And I was like, this is going to be an interesting experiment because I've coached quite a few route setters, and I've always kind of had it in mind that route setting, in addition to being a really physical job, is also super cognitively draining. And the brain is like one of the most expensive parts of the body for sure. Like so much of our decision making is just based around not turning the brain on because it's so expensive to actually run the thing. And like I had it in mind that route setting is probably like harder than, carpentry or something because of that cognitive effort. And also your climbing is like intermingled with the setting, and you're always climbing in a fatigued state after doing a bunch of manual labor all day. And so it was like really interesting to me to work with a carpenter, somebody who was working on their feet, swinging a hammer and stuff, 10 hours a day, several days a week, and then climbing on the margins of it. And actually, he was like recovering and doing, and was quite a bit more consistent than a lot of the route setters that I've worked with, just because, again, you get that thing where it's like, the feature that the route setters are setting is like driving their fatigue level week to week, or like if they do 2 days of setting on ropes 1 week and then 2 days of setting boulders the next week, they just get this massive fatigue spike in the bouldering week, and then they're trying to do the same training program week to week to week. And it's like, you're not the same person that you were last week because you're just under like way more stress and load than you were a week ago.
And that's it. I had a dog walker which I was surprised about how many more calories I had to put in daily because and it was about 500 or 600 a day. And she was a small woman as well, so it wasn't like it was surprising that she had to put that much in. But yeah, this is the thing is that that's why I always say, even in some of my sort of marketing stuff, I say life doesn't fit on a PDF. You put that sort of thing in place because it gives you structure, and that's important for everything in life, creating some level of structure, a template that you have some boundaries on, but then realizing that at different times you can't do what is on the spreadsheet, or if you don't do what's on the spreadsheet, it's not a big deal. I think that's sometimes even more important, where it's like, when people work with me, the first month you get a lot of the apologies where it's like, oh, I didn't do this, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't do that, and I'm like, this is not a big deal. It's not a big deal. This is if you can do this, it will be more helpful, I think, for you. And that's coming from me being a professional who's worked with people, and I've seen that when people apply this strategy, they are in a better place. But the fact that you didn't do it this week is not a big deal. But let's figure out why. Oh, okay. Actually, the timing of this doesn't work very well because, I don't know, you've got to pick up your kid from daycare or something. Okay, well then let's shift this. And then sometimes, if I'm working with somebody who's got a training plan, sometimes I'll say to them, well, why don't you go back to your coach and say, maybe we could change it this way in terms of maybe scheduling. And sometimes we work together with their coach and actually, yeah, let's flip the Tuesday and Wednesday around because they have to get up super early. And so that can work. So it's like being much more adaptable, and then just trying to figure out what works. And the plan is that the plan may change.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I always say we're not training in a vacuum. We're training in a real system that has a lot of moving parts. You kind of briefly mentioned like how in the beginning in the first call you'll try to get a sense of if somebody's like kind of how they are thinking about things and like how busy they are and whether or not they're the type of person who's going to read documentation and that sort of stuff. So thinking about those archetypes of like somebody who's very adherent and very engineering and like rigid sort of brain versus somebody who's maybe more freewheeling or loose, or even maybe just somebody who's too busy to apply the level of focus to it that some others would. How do you sort of treat those two different people? Do you have like general advice for those kind of archetypes that you could offer in terms of their nutrition and their nutrition habits?
Do you want the actual guidance or scenarios?
You don't have to drop all your lessons on the podcast. I'm just curious if you have
my secrets
rough take.
No, well, I mean, I think in a kind of meta sense of that, I think that one of the things which is interesting is expectations with people. And what I mean by that is that if someone comes to me and they are very engineered and they're very very specific and they like numbers and they like this, I can say that they're going to get a quote unquote better result because they're putting in more of these little micro steps that are going to take them towards a goal. Let's say the most basic thing was, say I'm working with somebody on a body composition change. If they are absolutely bought into tracking their weight every morning and even maybe tracking their calories in the first month just to try and understand what we're doing and having a very high level of self-accountability and accountability with me, we can pretty much guarantee that they're going to be further along than somebody who is coming to me and like, oh, I don't really like doing this and I like to change my meals every day and I'm not really... And that's fine because people are going to come. And sometimes I'm trying to convince somebody, hey, why don't you do something different? Meaning that you've paid me to help you. So why don't you give over some of this looseness and try the accountability because it might get you further along. But oftentimes it can be quite difficult working with people who are much, much more looser because they might have a very high expectation of what change they can make in their life. But their actions, or let's say their motivation for making more self-disciplined actions is less, and so there's a kind of disconnect between what they do. And you might have seen this in your climbers as well. If someone's willing to put in the time to do other bits and pieces, they're probably going to get further along than someone who doesn't. So there's that. But in the biggest sense, without going into real specifics, my what I call useful coach secret sauce is really this what I call managing load, stress, and strain, or rather adaptation. And the way that I view this is it was based off the work of a guy called Stephen Sellier. And it was basically, he was trying to figure out how do you talk about endurance level, load, and volume of training and recovery. And he used basically a standard physics model. So you have a beam, and the beam will deform under load. It will be stressed, and if it keeps being deformed, it will create strain. And you want to bounce back and recover, and that rebound is we could call adaptation. So everything I do is all about this. How do I manage someone's load? And that load is basically in relation to their capacity. And so my kind of rubric is how do I increase somebody's capacity? And that's both from a physical point of view with nutrition, into physical in terms of how do we manage the load that's been given to them by their strength coach and their recovery, and then also the psychological, and understanding that is also creating a deformation in your system, which I put a capital S, which is kind of, let's say, mind-body. So where the nutrition comes in, and what I said at the beginning is about being upstream, is to say, okay, well, whenever your body is under the most stress, which is basically I call the training window, is we just put a simple rule, which is let's provide high nutrient and energy availability around that window. Because I think it's more important to have that window of time being very, let's say, supported and being in a very anabolic point. And in terms of application, we're talking about protein and carbohydrate either side. And if it's a slightly longer session, carbohydrate in the middle. And it's less about how much fuel do you need for the session. Because if anybody would look at my spreadsheets, they would be like, Tom, you're overfeeding these people in this period of time, right? But it's much more about how do we change the state of the body going into this high level of stress. And so that what I call basically by the time they're coming out, they're like recovering in real time. And the reason for that is not because we have great science to show, well, having carbohydrates before training has a particularly good benefit. If anything, it's pretty lacking. It seems to do almost nothing, unless it's very long things, maybe over an hour, 30 grams of carbohydrate, 2 hours, maybe 60 to 90 grams. And I'm going, I want you to have about 100 and something grams of carbohydrate before in a 1 hour training session. Right? So I personally have 200 grams of carbohydrate. So I have 100 grams of carbohydrate before my training session, along with 30 grams of protein. And then as soon as I finish, I basically do the same thing. And then I go off to do my dance classes. And my training is normally 2 exercises, like 6x4 of deadlift, 6x4 of a weighted pull-up or something like that. And then some core stuff I do in between. But what I do is basically saturate the times when I'm most stressed. And I view it as a kind of buffer of that stress and converting that stress. And the reason I also do that is because the literature that I have read on things like training adaptations or fat adaptations or things like that, the manipulation of substrates, let's say low carb or something like that, is not doing any more and does a lot less than total volume of work done. Meaning that when you look at the latest endurance studies, I know this is getting a little bit technical, but it's an interesting
it's good though.
Side. When you look at the recent studies on endurance adaptations to people doing long endurance work, it's not coming from manipulating carbohydrate. Because the thinking was, well, if you reduce carbohydrate, then the body has to burn more fat. And so if you do a big cycling session, then you'll get better at fat burning, and so you'll become more efficient than when you go and do your race. And what we see, actually, this isn't the case. What we see is that if you go into a session carbohydrate replete, meaning that your liver and your muscle glycogen is full, one, you generally do more volume at work at a higher intensity, and it's the work done by the muscles that create the adaptation for fat adaptation. Right. Not that you can kind of view it as being like, the thinking would be similar to be like, oh, well, if I want to get better at climbing endurance, what I should do is I should do a bunch of bicep curls, fatigue my muscles out, and then climb fatigue, because then the body has to adapt to the fatigue state. And you're like, no, it doesn't work like that. You just get more fatigued. If you go into the climbing session being really fresh and climb really with great intention and quality and increase your amount of climbing that you're doing, that's what creates the adaptation. So you don't get better by doing things in a fatigued state. In the same way as that you're not going to become better at utilizing, that I'm aware of, utilizing or managing your hydration by going into a race dehydrated. It doesn't work.
You're not going to adapt to being dehydrated. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I made a meme quite a while ago about sleeping 15 minutes less every night so that you would progressively overload your resistance to not sleeping well.
That's right.
It's really interesting, the idea that the whole fat adaptation stimulus or that idea. The thing that it reminds me probably of the most is, because I talk to climbers about this all the time, is like they want to get better at being powerful on a board, and so they try to apply the same strategy to being powerful that they've applied to other areas in their climbing. which is they're going to go climb on a board and they're going to try to climb powerful problems as much as they can. Basically, they're going to have like 3 or 4 hour board sessions, like a couple times a week. And it's like, well, what adaptation do you actually get from that? You get 30 minutes of being powerful and then 2.5 hours or 2 hours of being moderately powerful and like almost sort of holding on to the holds, right? And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, if your goal is to be able to tolerate a lot of like almost kind of hard board climbing, then that's a really good strategy. But I mean, often people are coming to me because they've climbed a couple of V9s and they want to climb a V10. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you actually willing to do in your training? Are you willing to cut some of that fat out and really focus on the exact adaptation that you're trying to get? And yes, you're going to lose a little bit of capacity in the process, but if you just focus on that 30 or 45 minutes of very, very powerful climbing, and then maybe we'll go do something else, or maybe we add another climbing session somewhere else in the week, but then we're actually making sure that the stimulus that we apply is the one that we're trying to get the adaptation to. And it's that same sort of theory as like, if eating carbs makes the work higher quality, then you're theoretically still going to get a better adaptation because the muscles are going to be working harder. So yeah, I don't know if that analogy works for everybody.
No, I think it does. I think, you know, if the way that I've described it, it's the same as if you're doing a ketogenic diet or fasting or training fasted and all of these things. If you're trying to train for a zombie apocalypse and you want to train your ability to deal with suck, this is not a bad idea. Right, if you say you're like, okay, I'm going to go and do what's that marathon across the desert, de l'Arbre, or some French
the Badwater.
Or even that one, right? If you're trying to build grit, maybe there's some argument to say, well, let's just train in a dehydrated state. But if anything, it's probably the amount that you're going to get out of that versus actually just being really well fueled and pushing your body. So this is the thing that I do a lot with people is I want them to come back to me and say, man, I just feel like I want to do more work. And then I say to them, go and ask your coach. Right? The coach might be like, no, you've got plenty of volume. But ultimately, I want to make strength and conditioning coaches look great. Right? And I had that a couple of times where I've seen people post about their strength and conditioning coaches and how amazing they've become. And I'm being like, oh, you can say hi to me as well. Right? So, you know, I also have an ego. But most of the time it's like, how do you get someone to do the best and the highest quality they can? Because that really is creating the adaptations. The other thing maybe I'm stepping on some toes here, but one of the things I think is, how can I put this? The body doesn't know a crossover point between zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's not a point where your body goes, oh, now we're in zone 3, or now we're doing endurance. Or now, oh, hold on, you did one rep less, and so now you're doing hypertrophy. Or now you're doing power versus hypertrophy. Right? As if there is this cutoff point where the body's like, oh, you did 13, now you're doing hypertrophy or endurance level. Oh, you did 4 reps, so now it's strength. It's got nothing to do with that. We use numbers because it fits the model of the application of what we're trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what people got to understand is this thing of like, well, in the most simplest sense, you get good at what you practice. If I'm trying to hit, let's say, a 200 kilo deadlift this year, the only way I'm ever going to get there is if I put in, let's say, another deadlift session a week where I'm just doing singles. Mm. And what I mean by singles is probably something around the range of 92% of my 1 rep max and moving higher. There's no way that I'm going to do, let's say, maybe I could do 6 singles with, let's say, 3 minutes rest, 3 or 4 minutes rest between. But the point being is that I'm going to have to work very, very close to my max as an additional training stimulus. Why? Because there's 2 things I've got to go on. One, I've got to deal with the fact that it's an uncomfortable thing. Because part of the reason we see, for instance, people not working hard, and what I mean by hard is working in an appropriate RPE, for instance, or RER, or whatever we want to call intensity, is because they're not used to that. And as soon as it feels uncomfortable, they're like, oh, something's bad, right? So part of it, and actually I'm sure you see this with climbing as well, is part of the time you're trying to say that you need to push that grade a little bit just so you know what it feels like to try hard.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I think climbing is such a good sport for this thing of like the people who do so well in climbing are the people who know how to get into that position where they really try hard.
For sure.
Right? And I think that's, in terms of what we're trying to do with strength and conditioning, and also, you know, the point of me just feeding the crap out of people, is I want someone to go into that training session in this really highly sort of elevated state where they're like, I'm going to just do I'm going to push myself hard here. And it doesn't mean like what we could call just junk volume. It's not about that. But if you've given somebody, I don't know, and you're saying, hey, I want 4 reps, right? And they're like, before I could have actually done, let's say 6 reps. But I'm saying to Jesse that I'm doing 4 reps because that's what he said. And now I'm saying, you go in and you're totally fired up. And you basically are putting on another, I don't know, let's say 10 kilos on the bar. And now when you do 4 reps, you're like, I did 4 reps. And that's what was what. Because the thing is, it wasn't the 4 reps that is going to make you get that strength adaptation, right? It's the fact that you tried really hard and the weight on the bar was 4 reps. I mean, maybe you could get a really ugly 5th rep out of it. But
right.
it's this is the thing, and I think this is a great lesson in just in terms of general in life, is that we have to find the edge of this comfort zone, and we have to find it, and it's very weird because that's going to move back and forth depending on what your capacity is. One of the ways I talk about stress with people is I use this thing of, you can sometimes tell whether or not you need to pull back on your training, or let's say even pull back on your commitments to things, is if I said to you right now, hey, I want you to jump into an ice cold bath or take an ice cold shower or speak in front of the public. Like, what is your gut reaction? If you're like, hey, let's go and do it, to me that shows that your nervous system battery is nicely topped up, that you'd be quite able to do something that is clearly uncomfortable. But if you straight away go, I can't think of anything worse than to like just turn the cold shower on right now, what that normally indicates, from what I think, is that your nervous system battery is actually low. And that's where you've got to be careful with taking on other things that you don't need to. Now, what's sometimes interesting is that battery can be charged when you do hard stuff. And this is what's kind of weird. You might feel fatigued, you go and do a training session, and it somehow recharges your battery back up.
Yeah. So I feel like I've said this before, maybe not on my podcast, but on some podcasts, like I feel like I have to earn my motivation. Like I have to feel like shit and go have a session, and then I'm like, okay, now I feel good and I want to train more. Or I have to like make myself go hike up to something that I think I might want to try. Even if it's like an annoying hike, I'll go up there and look at it. And once I look at it, I'm like, okay, yeah, I do actually want to like bring pads back to this and do it. And I feel like I've kind of earned that. Because the next time I'm sitting on the couch, I'm like, nah, it actually did look pretty cool. Maybe I do want to go back and do it. And I want to say this before we move on too far. I think on the note of like, doing heavy singles to try to move up your 1 rep max, or even the idea of doing a shorter board session in order to get higher intensity and higher quality. I think the unifying idea there is the intent that you bring to, especially to any kind of training session. I think it also applies to other things in life, but we want to try to be really specific about the intent that we have in mind for the session, because I think it's very easy. Maybe this is an American culture thing. You tell me if it's a British culture thing too, but it's very easy to slip into this sort of like the goal or the intent of the session is to make it as hard as possible. And if we make it as hard as possible, then we can keep doing that over and over and we'll adapt to it. And I actually do think that works for a really long time. And I think that probably works pretty well for, let's say, a 23-year-old who their sport is powerlifting. I think making the session as hard as possible is probably going to work for them for quite a long time. The problem with climbing is because it's so powerful and it's so coordinated that as soon as you get a little bit tired, all climbing feels really hard. And so making the session as hard as possible could just turn into, you use the word junk volume, which I'm with some other coaches on, like, I'm mixed as to whether that's like really a good term, because you do get some other adaptations from the longer session. But if you want more power, or you want more coordination, or you want really harder climbing, because truthfully, harder climbing is not that much more physically taxing than slightly easier climbing, right? It's just way more specific in the things that it's taxing on. And there's soft tissue requirements and other things. But for the most part, what you're talking about is you want to make that session as powerful as possible or as fast as possible, and not actually as hard as possible, right, so that you avoid dragging into that territory where you're just doing something, you're just enduring more stuff that's not like super duper hard.
I think this is the thing: is it's hard is not. So
it's not specific enough.
No, how can I put this? One thing I don't know that is spoken enough of is the effect of learning in training, and what I mean by that is that it's in line with the less about some sort of metabolic or tissue level adaptation, but rather the fact that you are practicing and learning something in a different spectrum, on whatever the spectrum of this thing is. Meaning that we can here's a great example. You can quite easily see that one of the most specific and effective ways of increasing endurance adaptation is high-intensity interval training, right? It's incredibly powerful for things like mitochondrial biogenesis. Good luck running a marathon if all you ever do is high-intensity interval training, right? It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Now, the question is why doesn't that work? Is it a metabolic tissue-level adaptation? No. I think there's something else there. I think it's the fact that you're not practicing the thing that you're actually doing, right? And I think this is the thing, is that there is another element of this. The reason I use the singles in the deadlift example is not necessarily because I feel that I'm going to get any more strength adaptations necessarily from lifting close to my 1 rep max multiple times, but it's the fact that I'm practicing at a level that is, let's say, 25 kilos above what I'm lifting for my normal volume, and let's say 35 kilos or 40 kilos above my longer sets, right? Hard is a really great example of a word that is, I think, misunderstood. And we see this, for instance, in people doing wacky ass training exercises, meaning they do something classically on a Bosu ball, right, or something. Not many does this anymore, but use it as an example. Some balance drill whilst you're lifting that, and then one eye's closed and whatever, right? Stirring a cup of tea, and it's incredibly hard. And if you keep doing that, you get very good at being on a Bosu ball with one eye closed and stirring a cup of tea, and you will put that on Instagram, and people are like, "This is amazing." The thing is that you'll get very good at that specific thing that you've been practicing, which is incredibly hard and now is easy for you because you practiced it. But it doesn't really create much, right? And so hard is a really bad thing to think about when you go into the gym, because anything can be hard, right?
Yeah.
I think it's this intention. And for me, because I have this bias for movement and dance and maybe like introspection in terms of the way it moves and things like that, for me, it's about the quality part of it. Great example is literally 2 nights ago, in the evening, I just do walking drills, meaning I literally for half an hour walk up and down the studio, trying to understand where my foot placement is. Can I project, shift my weight, change foot, shift my weight? Because it's the foundation of all dance. It's like the quality of your literal walking. What I've done recently is I've shortened my steps, because what I was doing is I was trying to project my foot either forward or backwards to where it should be. But because the information and my stability was so bad, I was doing what I could call like slightly junk volume, because the quality wasn't good enough to learn the movement. It was like, there was too much stuff going on that was muddying actually what I'm trying to get, because I'm trying to constantly off balance. And if I carried on like that, I would have actually, I think, missed, it would take me longer to get better. So guess what I do is I regressed it and shortened my steps. And what that does, it means that, yes, it's not the final product that I want to get, But what it does is by shortening it is I now have much less noise of the movement. And now I'm like, okay, now I can actually concentrate on really putting my foot down. Oh, the other thing I did is I took my shoes off. I'm now doing it in my socks. And the reason for that is because now I can get a little bit more perception. I'm also not playing with the squeeze of the shoe.
Yeah.
And so what was really interesting about this, and I think this is the thing, is that when we are doing exercise, I'm not saying that you have to do everything beautifully. That's not necessary. But there is a thing where you need to squeeze it down or up, depending, to try and figure out what is this thing that I'm doing that the body is learning from, right? Because I think this is sometimes what is missed, because a lot of times we're thinking about whether this is creating some sort of metabolic adaptation. For instance, and then this is going to sound weird, I part of my brain doesn't believe that we can train energy systems. Like, I'm trying to get in the background and try and research to basically come out with something and say, what are you talking about? Because there's something inside me that feels, I don't understand I don't think we are, when we're talking about training energy systems, I don't think we are actually doing what we think we are doing. And the reason
I don't think I'm following you. What you mean, like we can't be very targeted about it, or help me out.
What I'm saying is that for instance, there is no anaerobic metabolism. There's oxygen present every single time you're doing anything.
Okay. There's no strictly anaerobic metabolism.
Yes. Right? You're always going to be using oxygen. Right? So the question comes in is also what are we doing there? Like how is doing some exercise modality making this phosphocreatine system better than another system? Right? This would be a much longer podcast, so I'll leave it there. But I'm trying to figure this out, because if you do listen to some sports scientists, when they talk about, for instance, people who originally came up with zones, they're pushing back on that now and saying there's no cutoff. So how do we know whether the body is sitting in zones or not? We don't know that. We have things that are threshold. We can see, for instance, lactate threshold and stuff like that. So we know, for instance, when you get past like 60 VO2 max, your metabolism is burning more or less of something else. But the difference is it's burning more of a scaled up energy supply. It's not like it goes here and then one drops and the other one goes in turn. No,
yeah, you don't have a literal gear shift where you're changing energy systems, for sure. No, yeah, that's something I try to be clear with people about. But the other thing about, especially in climbing, energy systems and climbing, like the specificity of the movement and the speed of the movement and the angle of the wall, like those things play such a huge role. Like I think people probably overestimate, doing 4x4s on a 40-degree board, like how much that's going to carry over to doing a 60-meter pitch that's 10 degrees overhanging. Like maybe there's going to be little bursts of that 10-degree overhanging wall where some of the forearm adaptations are going to be really similar. But doing like 4x4 style training on a really steep wall, most of those adaptations, I'm not going to say that they're going to be wasted, but for a large part, you're really creating a lot of fatigue and stress in the whole body by doing all these really powerful movements with the shoulders and the back and all that stuff, in order to get a relatively small amount of stimulus to the forearms. It's not that it's like a bad training modality, but it kind of speaks to what you're saying, which is like it's just a very indirect way to train like the capillarization and fatigue response of the forearms, right? So maybe that's kind of what you're trying to get at, is like maybe some of the training universe and climbing like thinks about these things a little bit too discreetly.
Yeah, I think I want to push back on when I see these, like, if you do this, it's an AND cap. If you do this, it's a this thing. If you do that, I'm like, really? I just don't understand how you would even know that.
Well, I mean, if I give somebody a session where I'm like, climb, like I really like to do like a aerobic power, that's what I would call it, session where it's like 8 to 10 boulders on a board. You rest 1 minute in between every boulder, and you do 2 or 3 sets of that. But at the end of the day, if the person chooses to do that session on V3s on the board versus if they choose to do it on V4s on the board, that's going to tweak the dial of like what energy system they're actually using while they're climbing, and thus it's going to tweak the amount of recovery that they get in between each rep. And like we don't have a super fine control over exactly what energy system is being trained by that session. It does require a lot of individual attention and a lot of auto-regulation, frankly, in order for the person to understand how it's supposed to feel to kind of train the thing that they're trying to train, right?
Yeah, and the other thing as well, right, is that, for instance, if something is quote-unquote anaerobic, we're talking about oxygen delivery, right? So if you have somebody who is very well trained cardiovascularly, what is their anaerobic workout? Sure, it's going to be different from somebody else.
Yeah.
Right? So the modality of training is not the thing. It's maybe the scaling of the volume metric, right? Or whatever the intensity to volume, right? It's not that I don't believe that exists at some level and that you can train things, but I think the training part of it is, I'm a little skeptical about whether or not we can speak with such direct thing about, well, this type of training is going to increase capillarization and this kind of training is going to increase, fast twitch stuff.
Right.
I think it's the fact that you're practicing one over the other. This is why power drops so quickly. Maybe I'm speaking out of line here, but I don't think power is dropping so dramatically because you are losing some adaptations in the muscles that quickly. I think it's the fact that you can't maintain that. You can't just train power all the time because the volume is so low, right? That's the point of power, is that you do it. You do something incredibly fresh where everything is snappy, and so the intensity has to be low enough, not too low, but it has to be low enough that you can just shift the thing. Why? Because you're practicing something different, right? So if I'm learning how to do this, right, that would be a practice because I know how to do that. So it's the same thing with power stuff. But if I don't ever do that and I just do very slow clicking or whatever, that was a very random thing. I didn't know I could do that.
You can snap very fast. That
it
was
obviously from my flamenco days. But I think the point I'm saying with this is I think the intention for the session, not just doing things that are hard, and having real intention of what is the primary thing we're trying to achieve. When I was a personal trainer, this was always the thing. I was like, what is our primary goal for this training session, right? And then we fix everything around that, right? So even my warm up with people was specific. So all my training sessions were always 1.5 hours, because the first half an hour was this prep stuff that we would do, or for 15 minutes, and 50 minutes at the end as a kind of nervous system cool down. But one of the things was that if we ever did anything, even in the guise of like a dead bug or one of these sort of things, if it was a power session, we did all of those things fast and snappy. And we tried as much as we can to not create any fatigue. So we wouldn't do the same warm-up and prep for a power session as we would do for, let's just say, volume session. Every single thing I would do on a power day was powerful. Even we would do back squats or front squats, and then we would jump between them. We would jump and then they would rest. Then we'd go back and do the back squat, and then you jump between them, and you do. And what it was just to constantly send this nervous system signal that this was a power session. And the other thing, which I think is important, is that you don't then, like, and this is not a tissue level thing, but maybe a nervous system thing, you don't finish a session where everything you've been doing is powerful, because I think this is a brain thing as well, right? Brain nervous system. And then you go and just do a whole bunch of like crappy volume as a finisher. And I'm not saying that because I feel that, well, you've now done endurance and so you've mucked up all the metabolic conditioning and signaling in the muscle, as if you have this, this interference effect. I don't think it's that. I think there is something in the learning part of the body and the brain and the nervous system that if you finish a high intentional power session and then you just finish on a high, you kind of walk away, and I believe in a certain sense that your body is kind of accumulating a learning thing here. Well, you've just done powerful stuff. Whereas if you do a high power session and then you go and sit on a rowing machine and just tire yourself out, it's almost like the last thing you did was what the body's going to kind of remember. Now, this is weird talking here, but I feel there's something to this, that if you go and do an intentional thing, whether it's climbing or whatever, do it, down-regulate your nervous system at the end, but do that by resting. Don't do it by creating fatigue. And you kind of go away feeling the effect that you were doing in the training session.
For sure. I think the other thing is, like, at least when I train people, I'm almost always thinking about the sort of big picture of, like, if I'm working with people for a long time, hopefully it's like, you know, many months of training someone, especially if they have a big goal. But interference effect aside, or like whether the signal is getting crowded out, or, you know, whether that's like a quote real thing or not, the big thing that you get is just that if you take the power stimulus and you add a bunch of fatigue to that session, and you do that every week, then cumulatively the next week's power session is going to be a little bit slower because you're still tired. You're Absolutely. More tired than you otherwise would be, right? And so that's where that sort of setting the intent of I'm going to move as fast as possible and then get the hell out of the gym is really valuable, because it means you're going to be faster next week, and you're going to be faster the week after that. And you're going to be, like, if you're trying to become faster and more powerful on the climbing wall, and you are already kind of a slow, you don't already have a high degree of speed and power on the climbing wall, because then obviously the adaptations are harder. But if you're the prototypical, like, slothy kind of climber and you want to become faster and more powerful, that's a fast adaptation, right? You just need a small enough dose, and it needs to be a very fast dose. But if you are doing that, like, you should feel faster and more powerful pretty much every week for the first few weeks that you do it, because it's largely a nervous system adaptation, not like a physical thing that you're training. Yeah.
Wowza.
You were talking about your walking practice. I want to jump back to that. The dance thing, because I had this idea in my head after we did our pre-interview of how funny it is to me how similar climbing and dance are. And yet I see all these, like, cool dance videos that you share, and it never there are certain, you know, flexibility type things that I see people do in those videos, especially like the back bends and stuff, where I'm just like, okay, yeah, I certainly could not do that without some training. But by and large, like, the majority of the stuff that you share, I'm just like, that looks really cool and, like, highly coordinated. But also, you know, it's like, looks like something that I could learn how to do. I really think of it as being something I could learn how to do. And it's so interesting to me that in climbing, we see people do really hard things, and we're immediately just like, oh, I'm not strong enough to do the thing that they, like, I get that, you know, we're using the arms and the upper body in a much different way in climbing and stuff, but dance seems like there's so much more practice focused and like skill focused, and climbing, I feel like culturally we're so, maybe this is American again, we're so strength focused and like holding on sort of focused. Do you feel that way? Because I mean, absolutely. Obviously you're more dance.
But absolutely, because I think the one is forgiving, the other one isn't. Climbing, I mean, I can do a V8. I could do a V8 now, and I haven't climbed probably much more than this year, maybe 5 times. Why? Because I've got strength. I'm also tall. Now, it depends on what the V8 is, right? I'm not saying I could do all V8s, right? But, you know, and the reason for that is that you can just get to the top of something, depending on the type of climb, right? Now, the margin is going to be small, but I'm laboring the point. With social dance or partner dance, it doesn't work like that, because you have another person involved, and as a leader you have to be leading the person, or in a sense what you're doing is you're giving a very clear signal of intention, and then you're following her reaction or his reaction, either or. So with a follower, it's the other way around. With a follower, they are listening intently for that clear signal, and then executing in as much perfection as they can, because the more precise they are in terms of their following of my intention, the more I can trust exactly where they are and also know what we can do together. And so in dance, what's so nice about it, I'm a communicator. This is what I love to do. This is why I dance, because it's communication on another level. Is this thing of give an intention, the person follows, and then you follow them. And you're constantly in this kind of like circle. In dance, similar to, I can imagine, other movement practices like martial arts, it is this infinite beginner's mind, because I'm spending, let's say, an hour to an hour and a half a week just walking up and down a dance floor, and it looks very weird, and it's taking me a lot to be not self-conscious about this, and this is a good learning thing for me, because I'm in a room and there's some people doing other stuff and I'm just walking up and down, right? But it's because we understand that the quality of the movement is the way that you get the most out of the dance. And so all of us who have a passion for dance have a passion as a leader in being the most magnificent leader to the follower, meaning that the follower will feel incredibly safe, will know where I am at all times, know that everything I'm doing is incredibly clear and it has a quality and it has a feeling and all this sort of stuff. And for the follower, it's like, can she receive and listen and follow and create her own creativity in the spaces that, and that's why it's back and forth. So everything about dance is about the quality of the movement, and you're constantly refining it, because the more quality of movement you have and the more efficacy you have in the skill of that execution, the greater your creativity can be and the greater the options. So when you see people doing crazy stuff, there's a new video I posted on my Instagram yesterday, which I hadn't seen anyone in Zouk do this, where he's just wrapping these arms, almost like salsa bachata background. You might not know what I'm talking about, but it's very, very interesting. And I was like, huh. Now, the person he's dancing with, Jess Lambs, is a phenomenal dancer. And you could see the smile on her face the whole time, because she was like, I didn't realize, in a way that she's learning that this leader is doing the stuff that she wouldn't expect. In climbing, I wonder that if people spent less time trying to get to the top of the climb and much more time focusing on continually refining some level of movement, maybe there would be a slight change in sort of gradation progress.
It's like it's so necessarily process driven. There is only the process, right? With a partner dance, like there's no. It's not like, it's not like if you do the dance right, you get to put a green check mark, like, oh, I did this dance, and you like put that on your Instagram, and you've commodified the partner dance. Like there is no finish line to get past. And in climbing, I mean, I personally, I think there is a finish line, or there is a check mark. Like I do believe that those things are real. I'm not going to say that I don't.
It's the joy of it as well. It is the joy.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that I don't try to send stuff, but I do think I try to remain very process oriented in my climbing. And I've been thinking about this a lot, because we had this is typical fashion for you and I. We had a pre-interview last week where I think we were supposed to talk for 30 minutes, and it was like well over an hour. And we were talking about this leader and follower thing, and I realized, like, you have both of those things in climbing. It's just that you're always the follower, and the thing that you're trying to climb is the leader. And it's very much not alive. It's not sending you different signals every time you engage with it. It's not improvised or maybe as curious of a process as it is with a partner dance. But for sure, every time you pull onto the wall, you're getting those little signals from it about what it wants you to do, and your ability to be open to those signals and to hear what it's trying to tell you is like absolutely the whole process of learning how to climb something really challenging, right?
Yeah, that's lovely, because I didn't think of it in that regards, but that's true. So I follow as well, because one of the things when you get to a certain level as a dancer, you immediately gravitate to try and learn the other side, because it's kind of a mysterious box, because I'm leading someone and they are or are not doing something, or I'm not hearing, or whatever. And now you're curious. Because the other thing as well is we're dancing with an infinite number of different people who are having infinite different moods and thoughts on the day. Yeah. So it's constantly changing, which is why it's
the passion to learn what it's like to be a follower is very... I've done a tiny bit of dance. It's been quite a long time. But it's like as soon as you follow for the first time, you're like, oh, I see. This is really challenging.
Yeah. And the thing as well is that what happens is that you adopt this thing of constantly listening. And the reason I'm going with this is that if you go with an agenda, on both sides, if I go with an agenda as a leader that I want to do a certain amount of moves or certain sequence, it totally screws things over, because the follower might not just be in the mood to do this sequence, or might not be at the skill set to do the sequence. And also, I'm speaking over. It's like we could do a podcast and I could have come to just talk about something, and you keep asking me questions and I'm just raffling off on my own, right? That's not a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing. And when you're a follower, you have to do this even more, because what you have to do is you have to be incredibly, almost in a vulnerable position, where you're like, I know what I can do. I can step in this certain thing. I can do these certain moves. I'm very confident in my balance and whatever. But I can't choose what I'm going to do until the leader says, hey, we're going to go in this direction. And then also I can't assume that, if I'm going to do a Ferragino, then I'm going to go into this and then into a bonus or something. If you do that, you're screwed. So you constantly have to go, hold on. And I think that's what's super interesting, I think, with climbing, as you say, is that you need to go in, and I think this goes back to that learning thing and that beginner's mind, is that, and everyone knows this in climbing, you can just do the same movement pattern on the same problem over and over and over again until someone comes along and be like, you put your foot here. And then you do it and you're like, oh, shit. Because you never saw, because you had an agenda. My agenda was to do this sort of move like this, right? Or even come with a preconceived, I'm tall, so I'm going to climb it in this way. And you're like, well, hold on.
The longer I climb, and especially the longer I coach, the more I think maybe the single most important personality aspect, or I don't know if it's really personality, because it definitely can be cultivated and paid attention to. The most important trait for really hard bouldering, like if you want to push yourself in true problem solving and movement, is openness. Because exactly what you're saying, like if you walk up to the boulder making assumptions like, I saw a video where they did it this way, or you walk up and you're like, well, this hold is too small for me, or I can't put my foot up there, there's no way I'll reach it, or whatever. If you make these like really sort of broad stroke assumptions about what you can and can't do, it's so limiting. And I'm not sitting here and saying that you can do everything and that everything is within your power, but I think people maybe underestimate, because they just tend to see the end of so many other people's projecting processes, like just how much stubbornness people might go through on their really difficult sends of being like, but can I put my foot up here? Can I put my foot up here? What if I like try these other things and learn these other moves, and every session I'll just keep trying to put my foot up here? Because I can't tell you the number of times that I've had a project where like I sort of ruled something out, but I kept engaging with it session after session after session while sort of building up this, kind of understanding of the rest of the boulder. But I'm continually trying to remain open to this one aspect that I'm not sure about. And then lo and behold, it's always like session 5 or session 7 or session 11 or something. I'm like, actually, if I've learned how to use these holds well enough that if I sort of shift over here a little bit, now I can put my foot up there where I couldn't put it before. And then inevitably I go, post a video of that, and people are like, wow, you're so flexible. I tried to put my foot up there and I couldn't. And I'm like, okay, well, it was 11 days of me trying to understand how to put my foot up there. And I am flexible. Like, that's definitely part of it. But I'm also mentally flexible. And I think that it's so important to, to just be careful about what hard limitations you put on yourself about what things you can and can't do, or what holds you can and can't use. Because people have so much more ability than they give themselves credit for. It's just a question of patience usually. And I think dance is probably really similar.
Yeah, it's incredibly humbling, and you do come away with incredibly magic moments. Well, here's a great example. So I was dancing with my friend Elaine yesterday, and we're working on a move which is a kind of displacement, and it's a really beautiful movement, and it's one of these ones that I really want to get. It's going to sound so crazy. I was speaking to somebody the other day about tattoos. I don't have any tattoos. But if I was going to get tattoos, I would go to a Brazilian to get a tattoo, and I'd have these 2 dance moves put on either side of my neck. One's called a soltinho, and the other one's called desprezado. Because these are my 2 favorite moves, and they sum up everything, and they're kind of like the thing. Anyway, I'm trying to do this desprezado one. And Elaine was saying to me, yeah, but you can do it when we just dance. And I said, yes, but I'm not choosing to do it. And she's like, what are you talking about? You do it all the time. And I was like, yeah, but I want to be able to go, now I'm doing the movement and I'm doing this and I'm stepping here. And she's like, but that doesn't matter because you're dancing. And I was like, no, it matters to me because I want to be able to know that I am choosing to step here, not for it just to come out of an outcome. And this is a very interesting thing. And I think maybe this is a follower-leader difference. Now, Elaine is learning to lead. And so she's getting an understanding of this. But what it is that in dance, multiple times you will come up with something just off the cuff. Sometimes it's a kind of a mistake that isn't a mistake. Maybe you've been in a different body position by mistake. You're overturned, and so what you'll do is you'll just, let me try if I can, wow, well, ended up doing a different move from this different position. From the follower's point of view, they're like, wow, that's cool. As a leader, this is like a scratch in your brain because you're like, I can't replicate that. And it annoys you because you're like, what did I do? Because you're not videoing yourself the whole time, but you know that you did this cool sequence and you're like, man, what did I do there? And you constantly search to try and find, when did I get that sequence together? Anyway, the point being is that, again, this comes into this sort of intention of practice. And I think there's this thing of like, yes, I could just do this movement haphazardly in the dance because it kind of flows. But I want to be able to choose to do that. I want to have the intention of, now I'm going to do that move. And the reason I'm doing that move is because my body is here and I've taken a step backwards and I'm here because it does matter. And I think with climbing, I think the grade of a climb forces you into this. Because I think as a climb gets harder, you have to learn these lessons because there's like a cap. You can't just muscle your way up past V8. It doesn't work that way. Like there comes a point where you have to learn to climb better, right? But even still, there's a lot of this weirdness about limitation. And to kind of come in a little bit of a full circle with nutrition, I get a lot of people who come in a certain body composition and a certain body weight. And the language that they will use is, well, I want to change my body weight so that I can climb this level. I'm not saying that that's not true. Many times that is true. And it is also something I help people with, for sure. Yeah. When it is a legitimate thing, we use it as another thing. This can be a limitation that we can adjust depending on their circumstances and whether it's appropriate. For instance, the lower body weight, right? But what's so interesting is that there is still not a comparison. I don't see people looking at other pro climbers and being like, well, I'm never going to climb like them because I don't have that body. It's less about that, but more about a kind of an internalized thing, meaning, well, I feel that if I was 5 kilos lighter, then I would be able to climb this grade that I want to climb. And that might be true. But my problem with that is that there seems to be a weird way to get better. Because it's almost like you don't really learn necessarily. It's not like I call weight loss sometimes a kind of doping, right? It's a tool that can be used to create a result. It influences the outcome. But it's not an upwards development. Meaning if you for some reason couldn't change your body weight, I don't know why, just physically you can't change your body weight, and so you're stuck at whatever it is, and you want to climb, I don't know, 8B, well then you've got to work really hard, right? And it's an upwards development because you just have to put the time and the focus in to get better with the body that you have. A lot of times people are coming in and immediately talking about limitations to their ability to do a certain climb because they're not in the body they think they should have. And it's an interesting thing because I don't necessarily say to people, well, that's just generally not true and we're not going to do anything about it. But it's really trying to tip people the other way and say, this is not a great focus. This can be, with my help and your coach, a side effect bonus that if you do the training and you eat better in terms of from structure, you will find that actually your body composition changes and your performance improves. But don't make the weight loss the thing that is going to take you to the next level in your climbing, because I'm telling you it won't. And the suck you have to endure, if that really is a high priority with you, is not sustainable. And you'll probably find at the end of the day that it's a lever that you pulled, and then when you go away from me, you might find that lever gets pushed back up again. And then where are you with it? Right.
Well, that's the thing with climbing performance, is like there are so many different levers you can pull to try to get better, but we have to recognize about ourselves that we are infinitely hungry as part of being an anxious human animal. Like, you're not going to get to V whatever and then be like, all right, I'm just cool with this now, and I'm retiring to, snowboard or mountain bike or whatever.
Hungry. You mean hungry in terms of performance, not hungry?
Yeah, and totally, some people will retire and they'll go do different sports, but they're not going to do it because they reach a certain level and then they just don't love climbing anymore. I've never seen it happen that way. People fall out of love for climbing for lots of reasons, but it's not because they reach the grade that they wanted to. That's very rare. I think what people want fundamentally is self-change, and they want the grade because they want the grade to reflect that they have changed. Yes. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can change, and changing your body weight is definitely one of them. But in my experience, what happens over and over and over is people cut weight, they see a performance increase because that's absolutely a real thing, but then they just want the next level, and cutting weight is no longer a feasible option, or at least a safe option, right? And so it's like, yes, that's a lever you can pull, but there's so many other levers that you can pull in order to perform better. Maybe let's save the one that you can really only pull once or twice for when you really have reached the point where there's not a whole lot of other moves that you can make. At least in my view, that just makes more sense because, and I've worked with so many people. Sorry, go ahead.
I call it cards. I was like, we'll play that card when we need to play that card.
Yeah. So it's a real thing, and you'd be foolish to say that it totally doesn't exist. It's just a question of risk and consequence, and it's also, to me, when people think that that's the first lever they can pull, I think they're very tunnel visioned, and there are climbers for whom maybe it makes sense to engage with weight change like sooner than later, for sure.
Oh, sure.
I'm not going to say that no one should, but for the most part, when I work with people who are prioritizing it or thinking it's something that they need to do immediately, I think that they're very tunnel visioned. There's almost always lots of other things that we can work on first. So in some sense, it represents a little bit of like an arrogance to be like, this is the thing that's really holding me back. Whereas again, I try to think of myself as a very like systemic and holistic type coach. So I come in and I look at the big picture, and I almost always tell those people like, yeah, for sure, you can drop weight, that'll help you climb harder. Or you could work on your fear of falling, which is holding you back in every single session, regardless of how much you weigh. And then once we get that really dialed in and you're climbing 2 grades harder because you're not afraid anymore, then we can come back and talk about the weight change thing. I think it's a really tricky subject because obviously everybody's experience with it is totally different. And I've had a lot of frustration with weight change in my own climbing life, as you know, not the same way that a lot of other people have. Okay, we've been chatting for a while, and I know we want to get into the third wave cognitive behavior therapy thing that you mentioned in our previous call. So I guess I'll just give you the reins. I know that this is something that you're educating yourself about and something that you wanted to talk about today. So I'll let you jump in.
Where to start with this? So I'm trying to understand. Like I said right at the beginning, I'm trying to equip myself to work with people on a level which is probably, let's call it maybe the more important level. Importance maybe not the right word, but there is the reason that we do anything is for reasons of other reasons, right? We're just a kind of constant feedback loop. One of the great things of doing a sport is we get this feedback on personal development. We learn how to try hard. We have all of these things that are influenced. But part and parcel, I think, of the reason that certain people gravitate to different sports is because there is some other stuff. Are we constantly trying to be good enough? Are we trying to find ourselves in it? And this is not to say that these things are bad, right? Or that there is some level of doing anything with some purity, right? Or for want of a better word. It's not about that. But ultimately, if I've had somebody come to me and I can see that they're really suffering, let's say in terms of their view of themselves or their view of their body. For me, I want to be better equipped to sort of to work on a level to try and give them tools to reframe the way they see themselves. Or for instance, even in terms of when they're doing climbing and they get an injury, or I have a client who has long COVID, and that is one of the hardest struggles I've seen, because they constantly are trying to weigh up the sport that they love and want to be a part of their life and the cost of it and how difficult it is for them to develop in the sport, and also to come to some level of acceptance that they may not climb the level that they dreamed they would climb. So for me, what I'm trying to learn is this toolkit, which is, and I may be getting this wrong in terms of definitions and things, so excuse me, because I am definitely still in this learning process with this. But is this, from what I understand, is this umbrella term of what they call cognitive behavior therapy, or this group of therapies or way of viewing things that are cognitive being mental and behavior being the actions. And it's really a framework that has been developed over many years, and it's been crystallized into different actual therapies. So one being cognitive behavioral therapy, another one being acceptance commitment therapy. And ultimately what it is this thing of like this loop of factors that the way that we think can influence the way that we feel and the way that we act. And there's loops and around, and there's difference between thoughts and emotions. And then there's also a physicality part of it, meaning that the way that you feel in your body can influence the way that you think and feel and then act. Both of us have physical things that we struggle with in our lives, and they're very directional in that way. They're kind of, I don't know what you call it, would that be bottom up perhaps? For me, I have this overactive bladder, which was a side effect of a lithotripsy thing to break up a kidney stone. I've had that for 10 years and it's dramatically changed. It's why I don't climb, fundamentally. Mm-hmm. When everyone went off to go to Fontainebleau, I could not get on the bus or get in a car because I had about a 30-minute window between toilet breaks. It's much different now because I've learned and I've changed things. But the way that manifested in my life physically dramatically changed the way that I think about myself and my behavior. And so what is the great thing about this, what we could call cognitive behavioral therapies, is that as a therapist or as a coach, because you can do cognitive behavioral coaching, which is less therapeutic, which is probably the direction I'm going, unless I go down more psychology route, is to try and identify, like I said right at the beginning, identify where I can come in and help someone, whether it's the physical part that we start with, or the behavioral part, or the way that they feel, or the way that they think. And this is what's so lovely about this, is that we've discovered that there's different directions we can come with people. What is now called third wave cognitive behavioral therapy is bringing in what we call metacognitive. And so metacognitive is thinking about thinking. How do you think about your thinking?
This is ideal for this podcast.
Right. And it's really about this other level of what is the going on behind it. Cognitive, this third wave is also bringing in things like mindfulness, meditation, and also hypnosis and hypnotherapy. And what that is in the most simplest sense, and that's the direction I'm going, which is what I'm studying, is called cognitive behavioral hypnotherapy. And the reason I went that route is because I'm very interested in the placebo-nocebo effect. I'm very interested in the kind of metacognitive way of why, for instance, the way that you'll approach something like a problem or the way that you think about something is influencing your outcome. I work in nutrition. There's a huge amount of placebo effect, right? Supplements in the main part are almost guaranteed to be a placebo effect, which is kind of scary. I can pretty much guarantee that outside of maybe caffeine and creatine, because I would take protein as a food rather than a supplement.
Sure.
Almost all the other supplements that you people are buying, I would guarantee that most of them are placebo effects. Because you have an expectation of these things working. You don't have a way of measuring whether these things are working, right?
Yeah.
You have a little bit of data.
It's almost impossible to disentangle, and especially when it comes to the stuff that you're putting in your body, because unless someone is just incredibly regimented about their diet, there's just so much daily and weekly change in the things that are going in anyways. So there has to be some placebo and nocebo effect in terms of just how you feel about the things that you're doing. And to that effect, like, yeah, unless the supplements are crazy expensive, like if they make you feel like they're working, then, I can almost be convinced that that's like a valuable, if they're cheap enough, that's like a pretty valuable move.
I mean, one of the ways you can tell whether something is going to be efficacious is if you quadruple or triple to the dose, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying people should do this, but yeah, go and drink 5 double espressos in half an hour, and you'll know that caffeine.
You're going to notice the difference.
But your beetroot supplement, right? Whether that's going to have an effect. Anyway, I don't want to go down that route. So what is interesting, if I take a line down why I'm studying, for instance, hypnotherapy, and some people might not, I mean, it's definitely different now. I think people understand a little bit more about hypnotherapy or hypnosis. But if I go down a little bit of this just to explain this, just so people don't think I'm crazy. The easiest way to understand what, when we talk about the term of hypnosis, is that really what we're trying to do is guide someone into a position of heightened focus on something. If I'm doing a guided meditation with somebody, right, which almost everybody's experienced at some level, what's normally happening is that you are starting in a relaxed position, or you're changing your state to be relaxed, because that's typical of meditation. It's kind of part and parcel of it. And then normally you're asked to focus on different things and then drift either back or forth. For instance, the position of yourself in the chair, the weight of your hands, maybe the breath coming in and out of your nose. And you might go between all of them, or you might be fixed on a single one, which is very classic meditation, maybe just the breath. Keep coming back to the breath, right? But if anything, the metacognitive part of it is trying to be removed, meaning that thoughts are going to come in and you want them to kind of go away. You don't want to be focused on what you're thinking. You want to keep coming back in a sense of stripping away, and that's what you're doing the reps of in meditation, which is very beneficial, right? It's allowing you to focus on something very... What hypnosis is, it is not a trance state, albeit some people will start to argue for the semantics of it. But in terms of you cannot be put under hypnosis. There is no trance. We've measured this. In an EKG or this, hypnosis looks like meditation, but the creativity part of your brain is a little bit more active. And this makes sense because what hypnosis is that we are guiding someone into a state of relaxation, and then we are trying to involve their imagination for a particular purpose. And what we're doing there, for instance, is, if you have an anxiety, what I normally do with people is that I will go and say, using language to help somebody relax. After that point, we're sort of saying, okay, I want you to imagine being somewhere that really makes you feel yourself. A lot of climbers, it is places that they climb, right? Like Red Rocks or something like that, right? And then from that, how they feel will actually change, meaning that the memory and the imagination of being in this place that they love, maybe in their van watching the sunrise, gives them this sense of well-being. It's a somatic thing, meaning their physical body is changing because they're remembering. This is not because of hypnosis. You can do this just sitting on a chair, just imagining, right? It just makes it easier when I've guided you with this sort of thing into relaxation, right? But what it's doing is that you can allow the person to physically change their state. You can then say to them, well, what are you thinking about? How are you thinking? And because their body is feeling good, they will think differently. It's as if their frame has widened, their aperture has widened. And now with this kind of wide aperture, you can then bring in things that maybe are anxiety driving. Maybe it's climbing, a type of climb that they're doing, or it could be spiders, right?
Food or whatever. It almost kind of sounds like assisted mindfulness, really.
What I call it, which is what I will launch as a program for people, is what I'm calling it directed imagination system change or state change. I haven't quite decided. And the reason for that is what I call, basically, I'm pulling away from using hypnosis as a word because it has a lot of weight.
It's very stigmatized, yeah. And I confess I'm totally beholden to that stigma. Like, I grew up thinking, cartoons where they're waving a watch in front of somebody's face or whatever, and I think that's what people associate with it. But coming into it from a discussion of mindfulness is totally a good way to capture my attention, because I feel like, I don't know, 2 or 3 times a week I'm telling a climber, like, the problem here is just that you're not engaged with what you're actually doing while you're climbing, and you're letting the anxiety or the fear take over the experience. Basically, your thoughts have taken control of the experience instead of you paying attention to what's actually happening. And you can practice that without climbing. You don't need to go climbing in order to work on your mindfulness. For most of these people, it's probably a question of just modern life is so stressful and and cognitively attached. It's almost like a worm feeding on your brain or something, and it's very, very hard to get away from. And so, people go climbing and they have all these other stresses and things that are interrupting them from being able to actually engage with what they're doing. And I think that manifests as fear and anxiety, but it's like an inability to get into a relaxed state functionally.
So where the separation between these two would be that we would call the mindfulness meditation part of the toolkit within hypnosis. Hypnosis, and particularly this cognitive behavior hypnosis, is a bit like Inception, the movie. Because what you're doing is you're saying, well, here's a crazy one, and this is why it becomes super fascinating. I can work with somebody and say, do a breathing practice. So I'll say to them, okay, I want you to take a breath in, hold it, and now sigh. And straight away, even just doing that, you'll feel your whole vagal tone increase, and you'll drop down, and my voice is a little bit lower, right? Just by that one. So in hypnosis, what we're doing is we're rehearsing scenarios, predominantly in a relaxed state, a different state than if you were doing it in a, let's call this wake state, right? And where it can become super fascinating is that I can guide them in their imagination to do the breathing in their imagination. So what it means is that I can say to you, okay, here you have an effect. How do you feel? I feel relaxed and calm. Good. Okay, close your eyes. Now what I want you to do is imagine you're standing in front of an audience now. How are you feeling? I'm feeling very stressed about this situation. Okay, in your imagination, take a breath and release. How do you feel? Oh, I feel relaxed. Okay.
That's cool.
Now I want you to talk in front of the audience. How do you feel? Okay. And that's, when you think about it, that's kind of weird. That you are imagining something that is that is a real thing in the real world, right?
Yeah, but I mean, there's so much research on the power of motor imagery, and there's motor imagery breathing research.
Yes. And
so it's not surprising to me at all. Like I heartily encourage people to include points where they can take deeper breaths, and for really hard bouldering, I'm a big fan of even thinking about what parts of my body I can breathe into while I'm doing tension climbing, and that stuff's always included in my visualization. So that's almost a more specific and nuanced example than just the general idea that if you think about yourself taking a deep breath, that will change your state. immediately. That seems like the obvious example.
Yeah. So I mean, here's where it will blow your mind. And this is when I understood this just made me go, holy crap. It's going to sound so crazy. One of the reasons that hypnotherapy works quite well is because people perceive that hypnotherapy does stuff.
Yeah.
And what I mean by this is that in most of the world, when you talk about hypnosis, people would be like, oh, you are in a kind of dazed state, you are cataleptic, you are sleepy, etc., etc. Part of the effect of hypnotherapy is the fact that the person is pretending to be hypnotized. And so they are, well, all hypnosis is self-hypnosis, but it is a feedback loop on itself, meaning that the people who get the best effects from hypnotherapy are the people who believe that they are being hypnotized.
Right.
Right? It becomes very weird because what happens is that when you're doing a session with somebody, most of the time I'm saying, I want you to imagine that you are being hypnotized. And some people will push back on the answers and be like, wait, hold on, like, aren't you supposed to be doing something to me? And you're like, no, this is all a game. We're using the language of hypnosis as the leveraging of you changing your somatic state. There's no such thing as hypnosis. This is what I want people to take away. There is nothing that we do. All of these inductions where we say to somebody, okay, look up in the thing and then close your eyes and then you take a breath. This is just a cue. Mm-hmm. It's setting you up for me to hit the ball. It's teeing off. We do these things called deepeners or convincers. And what it is we basically create situations where somebody will be more convinced that something is working. It's not that we're trying to trick anybody. It's just the fact that if you can do something that you get a feedback on, that it is doing something that is changing something, you will, in a sense, let your filter down and allow things to change. One of the ways that hypnosis is described is when we're watching a movie, we remove the filter of reality and we absorb ourselves in the storyline. We don't watch The Lord of the Rings and be like, wait a minute, magic doesn't exist.
Sure.
Right?
Suspension of disbelief, yeah.
What you do is you just give yourself to the movie. And if you do that, you have the most fantastic time watching the movie, right? It's the same as a book. Sometimes a book is much better because you really have to get into it.
Right.
That's what we're trying to do.
I mean, that's like, that speaks to me because when I was a kid, I wanted to watch movies because I could just immediately, you turn The Lord of the Rings on when you're 10 years old, or I don't know how old I was when it came out, 15 or 18 or whatever. And like, the minute it starts, I'm transported to that place, and that's a crazy example because Lord of the Rings is one of the most, perfect things ever in my mind. But, many other movies could do that for me when I was a kid. It didn't even have to have good production value or anything like that. It could just be, almost anything could move me in that way. And now that I'm an adult, it's almost like the threshold is so much higher because I'm so attached to I have that worm that's like,
That's why all children are very hypnotizable.
Totally. Exactly. It's like, and now that I'm an adult, I'm like, if the movie is compelling enough that I'm not looking at my phone, it must be really good. And I try really not to watch any movies or TV shows that aren't good enough for me to not want to look at my phone. I want to be hypnotized. I want to be in that sort of state where I am taken by whatever the thing is that I'm paying attention to, right? But it's so much harder than it used to be. Yes. And it's not just my age. It's also, I really think it's the phones, honestly.
Yeah. And the purpose of, the reason I'm studying this along with, let's call it waking cognitive therapy type stuff, is because the filter is part of sometimes the problem with the reframing. And what I mean by that is that an event may happen in your life, and it's everything you believe about the event thereafter that totally changes the direction of your life. And that also can be, for want of a better word, manifested in the body. I'm not saying the body keeps the score, which is a very common way of saying it. I don't believe that necessarily is true. I think people take that too far. But there is a sense that if there is something that creates... Well, here's a great example. I've done multiple podcasts, and when we started, I said, I've peed 15 times before this show. It's because in my head there is still a safety aspect. My body says when you have to be in a position of responsibility, and there is a time part of it, and you have to be there, well, you make sure that your bladder's empty, because lo and behold, I have to go and ask to go to the toilet halfway through a show. So it does a safety behavior, which is peeing 5 or 6 times before I have to come and sit down, right? So there is something going on. There's the connection between the mind body, that there's a story that gets looped. Now, a lot of times, if it's not a problem, it is a lesser safety behavior, right? So where hypnotherapy can help is, here's a great example. I had a client who many times when he would eat in a social situation, he would get food stuck in his throat. And he would have to get up from the table and go and throw up and things like that. This was not to do with some sort of gag reflex on the food. This was definitely some sort of thing that just kept looping when he was, and it was all very similar, tied to time and place and the rest of it. So one of the things that we've been working with is to take in his imagination to the worst case scenario. And what that was doing was, for instance, we took him right back to what I mean by taking him back, I'm saying we just used his imagination. I said, go back to when you were a kid in school, because this is kind of where it happened, and just practice that. What is going to happen? And he would then I have to go to the bathroom. Okay, so you can't go to the bathroom. Now what's going to happen? I just threw up on the table in front of everybody. Okay, how bad is that? It's really bad. Okay, describe what's happening. What do you think other people are thinking? Oh, they're not thinking it's such a bad deal. They probably think this is unfortunate. And what we did is we rehearsed this over and over and over again, to the point where, as we're hoping, there is a change in his nervous system and the way that his brain is no longer trying to fill in the gaps of in a catastrophe, because he doesn't want to go there, right? That's a lot of times it's about not going there, but rather practicing the worst outcome and then realizing, in a sense, and feeling in the body, oh, actually, this is not as bad as I assumed it was.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, the sensation is starting to change. He's not getting it as frequent, because it's the brain is having this new information of, actually, there is a different story here. A lot of times phobias and things like that are kind of a black, dark part of a story that your brain never wants to go to. And so you just fill it with horror, and then you do avoidance. And you never face the thing that is scaring you. That's what all phobias are. It's lack of exposure to the thing, right? So that's where hypnotherapy, in that very acute sense, can be quite helpful, or let's just call it imagination, system change, is that we're saying, hey, this is a safe place to do it. Let's just run the scenario, right? See where it goes. How do you feel? And then we can also use things to change the state of the body. So, for instance, we can go to the place where he physically feels horrible. Now, once you go to your happy place, which for him is a van and the sunrise, and it has all the color of oranges and whatever. Okay, now, in your imagination, go to that place. Have all this color and all this stuff. How do you feel? I feel peaceful. I feel calm. Good. Now, let's go back to the table. You're throwing up in front of everybody. How do you feel? Amazingly, when you hear people talk back, one of the most amazing things about the nervous system, when we are in that sort of fight and flight stress position, we become very narrowed to a specific thing. And all peripheral starts to disappear. And all creativity of problem solving disappears, and we get hyperfixated on a single thing. In climbing, I can imagine what it is you're just going for the same damn hold the same way over and over, right? One of the advantages of creating parasympathetic state or having what they call vagal tone is that what happens is that you suddenly widen your peripheral vision, and you suddenly get all this creativity happening. and your brain starts to get creative ideas to this thing that was so catastrophic. And it's amazing when you listen to people while I'm in this sort of state of when being relaxed, and I'm talking and I'm saying, tell me what's happening, tell me the story. They start to fill in new information that they didn't do the first or second time when we're running this narrative. So ultimately, what we're doing with hypnotherapy, in a sense, is we're rehearsing a narrative in their imagination in a previously changed state, meaning relaxation or feeling very powerful or whatever, and then practicing that, and then through that we can kind of go back and forth in the imagination using all of their senses, so their imaginative smell, hearing, taste, experience. And that's really what it is. It's kind of playing in a daydream. That's kind of what you're doing intentionally in a daydream, and using things to just reinforce that change is happening. It's absolutely fascinating. It's quite a unique thing, and it works in some areas and not in others. It works dramatically in some areas. It's mostly used in dental work for people who don't want to take painkillers. There's whole surgeries that are done under hypnosis.
That I've heard. Yeah. Pain modulation, big one. There's lots. I could keep going on, but I won't. But the dentist. I want to mention the dentist thing because I was actually thinking about saying this before. So I just made a post about this. It's not something I talk about super often, but I have problems with my digestion, and one of my main problems is just that my body, the rest and digest state. Like I certainly rest a little bit, but my body doesn't really like to digest. It's not something that it really enjoys doing, and so it's just more fickle for me than it is for a lot of other people. But if I can get into a really good parasympathetic state, either by going for a long walk or just sitting and relaxing, I really can't get it from watching TV. I can't really get it from reading. I definitely can't get it from working. That's a big thing that I've learned about myself, is that if I'm working or I'm connecting with someone, connecting with a client, I don't know if my brain is too switched on or if something's physically wrong with me, but I don't rest or digest in those states, even though I might be seated and not actively exercising or whatever, right? But one of the most interesting things to me over the last bunch of years, as I've become aware that that's part of my problem, is that certain things in my life that I would not expect to work for that state do work. And one of them is going to the dentist. I can have breakfast and it could be an hour later, way earlier than you would expect me to have any motility happening in my gut. And I can go to the dentist and lay down on the chair, and the lady can be jabbing into my gums, and it can be incredibly painful. And my body's cool, we're digesting now. We're horizontal. We're breathing. We don't have to be aware. We don't have to take care of anything right now, even though I'm in objectively a stressful situation. Someone is jabbing me with a sharp object, and my body's still this is a good time for us to chill out for a second. And I find that I have no fear of the dentist or problem with it. I literally want to have nice teeth when I'm older, and so I just feel very okay with them cleaning my teeth and jabbing me or whatever. I know that they're doing their job. It doesn't stress me out. And I think there's just something about that my body is okay, this is the place where it's okay. And I that's so counterintuitive to me that I just have a really hard time wrapping my brain around it.
Well, here's going to sound like a totally side thing, and I'm not saying that this is legit, so nobody shoot me down for this. You must have heard the 5 love languages, right? This so-called. Yeah. What are your 2 love languages? Which make you feel the most loved?
That actually makes sense. I don't remember what they are explicitly, but I think acts of service is one, right. And then which totally makes sense, and then maybe quality time. I think those are.
So that's what I was hoping that was going to be the answer. That somebody doing something for you makes you feel very valued and loved. Yeah, and that's why your body takes it as a. Right? Yeah. I'm sure if you go get a haircut, it's probably the same thing, right? If you get a haircut or hair wash, maybe.
Yeah. I feel like a haircut a little bit less, and I actually think it has a lot to do with the fact that I'm sitting up instead of laying down. But that's probably more of a physical thing than I think. Maybe I could get my barber to let me lay down while he cuts my hair. That's a really interesting connection you make, because the funny thing to me is I can't just go lay down in the middle of the day and feel relaxed. That's not enough. My brain is just my brain is it's an unstoppable force of anxiety. It needs something physically to be happening, I think, in order for me to actually chill out.
Yeah. So one of the things that you can, here's a kind of tie-in with performance, right? So if we think about resting muscle tone, right? If I call this the Bruce Lee thing. If my bicep is relaxed enough, then I can do a punch, right? If there's a little bit of muscle tone, I can't punch it, right? When we are in more of a sympathetic state, what's going to happen is our resting muscle tone is going to be slightly activated, right? Now, there's a difference between being, let's call it like, and I'm using activated in just a loose term. There's a readiness, right? That's where you feel relaxed, but at any moment I could switch on, right? Then there is too parasympathetic, where you're kind of like, okay, I just want to go back to sleep now, right?
Sleepy.
Or there's too sympathetic, where you're just like, I cannot get my arm to relax type thing. So one of the things you can think about is that environment, which is ultimately what's happening, is the body or the nervous system is interpreting the environment and is changing your muscle tone. In the most sense, it's going to collapse you inwards. So if you are under stress or you are feeling vulnerable, which is kind of the same thing, your whole body is going to micro collapse inwards. It's going to contract, because anybody who is scared or feeling sick will withdraw and roll in and make themselves smaller and pull away, right? If you are approaching something, let's say a climb, and you are thinking about something, or there's stuff that's happened in the day, or whatever trouble, financial trouble, you maybe had a fight with your partner, or maybe you're worried about your gut, you are going to micro close in, which is going to affect everything from your joint angle to your power, right? So one of the most important things, and when I did body work and nervous system change with my clients, PT clients, is one of the most amazing things about the nervous system is it works bidirectionally. Meaning, when we're stressed, we apical breathe, which just makes us more stressed, right? And the way that we can change it, if we can't get out of our head, and this is one of the most important things, is if you are feeling cognitively stressed, you can't outthink that. But what you can do is direct the body in a sense. So if you then open your body up and force yourself to breathe very deeply, this sort of abdominal breathing, belly breathing. You do that for a little bit, amazingly the brain follows, and it has the loop the other way. And so one of the things you can think about is that if you're going into a performance or a climb and you're feeling stressed, you can fake it to change it bidirectionally, meaning that you can stand in front of a boulder and take some breaths and being like, I'm fucking great, right? Or even remember, and this is what the hypnotherapy and the thing, is you can literally stand there and remember what it feels like to have your teeth done. And your nervous system will go, ah.
Yeah.
And then you'll be able to perform better.
I thought you were going to say, remember another time that you were able to get into a good flow state in front of a boulder, because that's something I do.
You can also,
all
that's
the
the
time.
same thing, right? That's a kind of a loop. But the thing is how do you get into that flow state? And that can be done with something completely unrelated to climbing, which is sometimes, so I call it, here's a great example. People who've been following me for, let's say, 5 years or more would have known that my logo used to be red. And that used to be red because of, I won't explain, that was a very different time of my life. I was very religious, and this was actually related to the blood of Christ, actually. It was very Christocentric, a very long period of time. The blue, the reason it switched to blue was the blue of the Canary Islands. I went to the Canary Islands once, and I have never seen my nervous system downregulate so quickly. Right? I grew up on the coast in South Africa, and I live in London now, so there's not much. Went on holiday there once, and I was in the water where there was no horizon and sky. It was the most bizarre thing. There was a slither of a line of the horizon, but they were the same color. So it was just this infinite blue, right? And I just bobbed in the water for God knows how long, right? It had such an impact on me that even talking about it, my whole nervous system just goes, ah. So what happened is I realized this atmosphere, this color, has this effect on my state of being. So I thought, hell, I'm just going to switch all my branding to be this kind of blue and try and remind myself as much as I can of this blue, because it has an effect on how I see myself. Now, you know this. If you have something like a bladder issue or an IBS issue, this is a really hard thing in life, because you might consciously be very confident, but your body is like, hell if I'm going to be confident for you. And so you have this very heavy internal battle where you want to do something. Now, I do partner dance, which means I have to show up very grounded and very confident in myself to be able to be present there. And as soon as my bladder's doing things, all I want to do is make myself smaller, not take
I'll be open.
a lead, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that people can play with is to think, is there somewhere or something or some memory that has what I call, when I do hypnotherapy with people, an atmosphere to it? Can you put a color to it? So if you imagine, anyone listen to this, what they can do is they can just imagine some scenario in their life, whether they're in a van or climbing or childhood thing or with their partner. Imagine everything around that and then see if it has in your mind a kind of a color or even a changing swish of colors. And then what you do is you then use that kind of swish of colors, that before you climb, that you kind of just take a moment and you remember that swish of colors. And it can be a really interesting cue to just be like, and it drops you down. And this is really what hypnotherapy and this sort of cognitive, this third wave, sort of mindfulness, all this sort of stuff, metacognitive, is we're playing with this. How is this changing? What is happening in the body and the mind with these things? It's really, really fascinating.
It's super cool. It's only one baby step away from so much of the stuff that I do in my own climbing and so much of the stuff that I work with clients on. I'm just thinking about, a couple of weeks ago, I did a boulder that was pretty meaningful to me. And all I wanted to post about and share, and I shared this the next day, was just how it felt to get into the state in which I did that boulder, because the fact that I got to the top of this thing felt so secondary to the accomplishment for me, that I was able at that time, with all the stuff that's been going on in my life, to sit there and achieve that kind of radical calmness in which I could reach the flow state necessary to climb the thing. That felt like the achievement. And this goes back to what we were saying about dancing being very naturally process oriented, and so we're very able to focus on it as a skill, versus climbing being very outcome oriented, and so we get all these stopping thoughts about I'm not strong enough to do it or something like that. I talk to people all the time about being process oriented versus being outcome oriented, and I think I said this earlier in the show, but I want to expand on it a little bit. I really think the difference is just that the outcome does not change you. I'm not any different for having climbed that boulder than I was before, but as I've gotten better at dealing with the pressure of trying things that are that hard for me, things that have such a lofty grade, that process, being so invested in that process of trying something that feels so insurmountable, that process has changed me. And so you go through this journey, and eventually you get somewhere where you're able to look back on the process and see all this change that you've gone through. But we're really quick to assume I'm now at this place. I've gotten on top of this thing. I'm different now. But the change was what was happening during all that tribulation, right? And I think that's that's what I want to take away from the experience, and that's what I want other people to take away from the experience too. I almost feel bad. I need to come up with a better way to deal with this, because I've had people congratulate me because the thing that I climbed has a higher number, and they'll be like, "You're a such and such climber now." And I'm like, I just really don't want it to be about that, because it makes it seem like because I got to the top of this thing, now I'm different than I was before. And it just doesn't feel like that internally. And so I don't want it to be represented that way externally.
Maybe you should never finish a climb. Always. Always.
I don't know if I could go. Well, I mean, I do spend most of my climbing life doing that, actually.
But as you're going to go and touch the last top, You just like, no, I'm going to leave it undone.
I mean, the amazing thing about those kind of flow states and this climb really in particular is like, if it really is at your limit, and I feel like for me that was a friend of mine was asking me like difficulty wise if it was the hardest thing that I've climbed, and I'm debating it, but one sign that it's something really, really hard for you and that it was a really, really good performance is just there's no room for anything else to be happening cerebrally while it's going on. And so you just get into the flow state at the bottom, and I was there breathing for several minutes, and then the next like actual moment of awareness that I experienced as it's happening, I'm already on top of the boulder and like emotionally reeling. And everything that was happening in between is just like light and sound. There's no like reaction to it, you know what I mean? And that I mean, to me at least, that is the closest thing to a reason for being alive that I can even come up with. I can't think of a more interesting and fun and like compelling concept than that, which is funny because it's a little bit like an annihilation or something. But
I mean, I would say that is something I miss from not climbing, because as much as I like deadlifting, there's very few times that I lift and go, yes. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, it feels just kind of horses for courses, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, I mean, I predominantly did board climbing because I couldn't really travel that much. And there are times when I've just been on my own and I've looked at a problem and I'm like, don't change it. You know, we had a light up board and I was just like, you've chosen it, just do it. And you're just going to sit on this same problem. And if it's way above your grade, you just do as much as you can. And then when you do it and you're on your own and you're just like, fucking, this is amazing. Like, you know that you did everything possible. And, you know, obviously it's even better when you can't do it the first day and you come back, right? And you're doing it. I mean, that's obviously the joy of projecting or anything. I was thinking about this the other day. I don't necessarily have so much of that in my life anymore in terms of, let's say, the hard edges. And I think part of that is, it's an interesting in terms of, am I missing out on a little bit by not having hard edges? I think so. However, I think because of my health condition, I think I have a lot of hard edges all the time. Mm. And so I think what I found with dance, because I gave up dance because of the bladder issue and my life collapsed because of it. And I think what's interesting now is that I'm in a place where the technical mastery of the skill, in a similar sense of, let's say, doing like Kung Fu Udang or something, where you're just doing this movement practice, constantly refining and learning this, maybe an internal practice. It's a different type of thing. It doesn't have hard edges. The outcome is not really very evident, but you see evidence of it. You see evidence of your practice the whole time, right? Which is really lovely. But it's an interesting dynamic where I don't have in my own life necessarily something that is pushing me right up to the edge of my comfort zone in the same way as something physical. I have a lot of psychological things that put me right at the edge, but I don't necessarily have something that's, which is an interesting thing, whether or not that's something that maybe for a season at the moment I'm not doing, but will bring back in later.
I think the physical high effort for me is not mandatory. Like, it's really enjoyable, and I do like pushing myself in that way. And, you know, to call back to what you were saying earlier, I think that I am good at trying hard. I think that's a really useful skill as a climber. That's something I feel like I had even before I really started climbing. I had that inside myself. But it's the flow state and the like ability to get out of your own head. That's the part that I really, really appreciate, and I feel like I'll be latched onto that until I'm.
I mean, that's all dances. That's why.
And so many other things too. Appreciation of music and playing music.
Yes.
Even cooking. I feel like a lot of the time if I'm cooking, I forget what I'm doing and I zone out and I'm kind of intuiting and I usually burn something, but I'm enjoying it while I'm doing it.
Also, you know, we get a lot of flow state people trying to get into flow state. I view flow state the same way as sleep. You cannot make yourself sleep, right? Yeah. And I think this is the way to do it, is you can't chase the flow state. because you kind of, that's why you can't do it. You can't make yourself sleep. The flow state comes when you're not paying attention to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the joy, is that if you get so engrossed with the thing that you're doing, that's where you suddenly notice it. But it's also a little bit like a daydream, where as soon as you start noticing, you go, oh, no, don't pay attention to it.
Yeah.
I lost it.
That's what I was saying about the margin has to be really small, because if I have too much margin, my brain gets in the way. You know, and it's like if the climbing is easy enough, I can be cerebral and thinking and stuff, and it's fine. I can remain in close enough. I can do a close enough job. It's an approximation of a flow state. And then up here you have it's where it's so hard that I have to be in perfect flow. And everything in the middle is actually like the most challenging, right? Because like I have some margin for thinking, but I can't be thinking or I'll exit the flow state and fall. And that's like, you know, that's probably the zone where you get better the fastest. That's probably the zone of progression. But for sure, like true flow states for me, I feel like a wizard. I feel like I'm casting a fucking spell and like transporting myself to some other realm. And like I don't always cast the spell right. For sure,
no,
sometimes I'm just
What is so magnificent about partner dance is that it is a partnered flow state, right? And it is quite incredible, because what's happening is that the central, the thing that we are pivoting around is generally the music, right? Sometimes you'll get a disconnect with people because maybe they don't hear the music the same way you do. But when both of you have an inkling of what the music is doing, and you are also listening to both of each other to see how we're interpreting the music. For instance, I move a lot more. I look a little bit more tango-y. Some other people a little bit more urban, and they're kind of like, it's a lot more staccato. I'm very legato. Mm-hmm. What happens is that you get into this thing where you're kind of reading each other's mind the whole time. Mm-hmm. And when the flow state happens is where you're both giving each other space to express your interpretation, but it's so micro, because you're a partner dance. You don't necessarily have a disjointed place to do something, though you can. And what happens is that you end up just doing things, and you're just like, wow, oh man, and then we're hearing it, oh yeah, and you're constantly in this like little thing, and you'll finish a dance sometimes, and most of us just end up hugging each other at the end of it, because we're just like, holy shit, what the hell was that? And this is what is magic, and this is why it's so addictive, because you get to experience this connection with somebody in this flow state, and you both know when you're both in it, because you start to do stuff that you're like, what? Like, that's cool, right? And we're both kind of surprised, like, I didn't believe that we could kind of... And it's not about a movement, it's kind of a quality, a qualia of it, right? And
you almost... It's like, don't talk about it. Don't notice it. Don't mention it. Don't engage with it, you know? Otherwise, it's because it's like a spark. It's like when you're trying to start a fire, it's like a spark. Right. If you pay too close of attention to it, you smother it.
No. But I think if we're zooming down to, you know, a little bit more like philosophical or life lesson, I think the reason that this stuff feels so like inherently pure humanness, for want of a word, I think it's because it's the very few times when we're not self-referential. It's the very rare time when we're not constantly weighing and measuring and analytical, and particularly in terms of self-values and values in a group, values in the wider circle, whether we're good enough or bad, or whether we're bad, whether we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. It's very, very empty. And I think this is any spiritual practice. This is really what has been from the big dawn of time. This is why we use things like psychoactive substances, because we're constantly striving for this state where we're really not preoccupied with who we are in reference to everything else. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the thing that, like, we are trying to find, and this is the process of all processes, is trying to remember these times and these different ways that we can reach this point where we're really not constantly self-referencing. You know, we've been speaking for, I don't know, 3 hours, 2 hours, 2 and about.
2 hours, yeah.
Every now and then I'll catch myself in the video and notice that I'm present. Oh, that's me, right? Mm-hmm. But when you have a great conversation with someone, you get lost in this flow and you totally let go of who you are. You're just in this connection. And I think this is the thing. And we can do it with rock. We can do it with dance. We can do it with music. And I really think it's one of these things to just, this is what we should be pursuing, is this connection with people void of self-reference the whole time. And I think it's the hardest part of all, for sure.
Yeah. A place of no self-judgment. That's a place where you can do great things, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like that's a very good stopping point. Is there anything about your services that we didn't talk about that you want to cover, or do you want to just give
No, I mean, I think if anybody, I'm very easy. Find me on Instagram at Useful Coach. My website is useful.coach. And from Jess's encouragement, I'm going to be doing more marketing because I need to talk. I love talking about what I do, but I'm not very good at it. Maybe it's my Britishness, a little bit,
maybe
a little bit.
Well, when you do make content, I think people appreciate it. I certainly appreciate it as a coach too, because nutrition's not my area of expertise. So I have a lot to learn there. And obviously, from this conversation, you also, know a lot about a lot of other things too. So it feels like marketing to you, but I think to a lot of the rest of the world, it just feels like learning. And so, of course we need that.
But yeah, you can find me all these places. And, if you want to work with me, just reach out and we can chat and see if we're a good fit and if I can help you. Yeah.
Cool. Cheers, Tom. This was a really fun conversation. I agree. I'm not sure exactly where the time went, but that was fun.
Thank you so much. All right. See you later, man. Bye.